So today what I thought I would do is go ahead and walk you guys through the project I'm working on for the month of April. And what I'm going to be doing is taking this finished concept piece into Blender and creating all the assets. The sword is finished at this point, but I'll be working on texturing for that as well and updating that. And so I want to walk through today the process of a little bit of the thinking that goes into how to take it from the concept phase into the next phase of production and then finally to the finished 3D illustration. So this is going to be a pretty short video, about 10 minutes, and I'm just going to walk you through how I think about going from one stage to the next and some of the things you might need to think about if you're working on some 3D illustrations for your own work and things like that. So let's jump into the video. Now this is going to be playing 2.5 times speed. I'm just making notes. That way you guys have something to watch while I talk. But basically, I'm going to start off by kind of going through and walking through the thinking. So start off with this piece. I spent all of last month kind of getting this done. Worked up to a point where I know what I need to do as far as having a roadmap to move from this to the next step, which is definitely 3D. Now, not everything's going to be 3D, so I need to make a plan. So the first thing I need to do is look at this painting, and I need to go over what I need to do, what my goals are, things like that. And then after that, I need to come up with a plan. Now, after the plan is there, the only thing really left to do is work, but I have to work as efficiently as I can and keep that going until the project's finished. And this is where a lot of people drop off, is they'll get a plan, but then they won't follow through. And then I just keep doing that until the thing's over. So I go back to step one and I assess my new goals and my new needs, and then I make another plan, and then I just keep repeating that cycle until I get to the finished illustration. And you can do this as many times as you want. You might do it one time through. Probably will do it a lot more than that. But this is a little bit of a sort of sketch just to kind of show the difference in thinking. Rather than linear on the left, you want to think of it more like a cyclical, is that the right way to say that? Way of thinking in terms of this process. So you're going to do it multiple times, not just one time through. And so now we're going to go ahead and move on to the next stage. And I'm going to start assessing what I see in my illustration. And so you'll see me making notes about different aspects of what I want to look at that help me figure out where I need to put an emphasis. So what I'm doing now is I'm splitting out the foreground, the middle ground, and the background as far as areas of the image. And so the two pieces in the foreground, we're going to kind of separate those off and make sure those are in a different rendering layer. The middle ground will have a focus, and then the background will have its own separate sort of staging area. And the reason for this is that you need to know how to split your render layers up, because that can save you time when you get to the compositing stage. You need to know what levels of detail you need to have throughout the image. So right now I'm just kind of color coding foreground, middle, background for you guys to give you a little bit more of a simplified version of how this looks for this painting. And once you have a clear idea of what your foreground, middle ground, background elements are, you can start layering those, splitting those up as you work, and you can figure out, okay, does everything need to be perfectly visible all the time, have perfect detail? No, everything in the background is not going to be seen at 100%. It's pretty small, so I don't need to spend as much time working on that stuff. And so what I also want to do with this process is determine what is going to be two-dimensional and what is going to be three-dimensional in nature. And so what I mean by that is not everything I do in this image, since I'm going to be working it up in Photoshop by the end of the process, needs to be done in 3D. So some of this stuff can be done with brushwork in Photoshop in a couple of seconds or a couple of minutes, whereas if I did all of that in 3D, it would take me a lot longer. So I'm trying to figure out, by breaking the image up into pieces, what needs to be done in 3D and what I can get away with in 2D. And this is a pretty common technique. Not everybody knows how to paint, so if you don't know how to paint, I would recommend really working on those skills, because they can save you a lot of time in post, and you won't have to waste time doing 3D models and things like that that aren't really going to be the emphasis of the project. So what we see here is we see a lot of 3D I'm going to have to do, which was expected. But there's a lot of 2D we can do too. And right here, I'm just listing out all of the software that I think I'm going to have to use for this project. So we got Blender, MakeHuman, which is an open source program to generate human models, which is quick. And I think that's something I'm going to start using. And then we got Photoshop, Substance Designer, and Painter for texturing, which I'll use with Blender and Photoshop together. And then Instant Meshes is something that Gleb kind of shared that I checked out last night, and it is a cool piece of open source software that will allow you to automatically retopologize your meshes. So some of this stuff I can throw in there really quickly, get it done, and then move on. I won't have to spend a lot of time doing that in Blender, which is good because a project like this is going to take a while to do. And so now that we have an idea of what software we're probably going to be using, now I want to make a list of what's going to be done in 3D and what's going to be done in 2D, because that's going to give me a better idea of the kind of work that I'm going to have to do and how I need to allot my time for that. So I'm listing out everything right now in columns, 3D assets on the left, 2D assets on the right. And by 2D, I mean something I can basically paint in Photoshop, something that I can do with brushes really quickly, or something that I can bring in and use from another resource. And so some of these are going to have overlap, which I'll talk about in a minute. But basically, you're going to see a lot of this stuff is going to be done 3D, at least to a certain level. And then I'll take it into Photoshop and I'll touch up details. So the village right there, the people, you can see there's overlap because some of the crowd that I might paint into the back will be done with brushwork. Some of the people in the foreground are going to be 3D. So you don't need to have one or the other. You need to have both. And Photoshop is definitely going to be used with Substance to create micro details in the surfaces that you see. And the further they get away from the camera, the more important this is, because it really saves you render time with lower geometry and things like that. So just trying to mentally get a bird's eye view of what's going to go on here. I know for the clouds and stuff, I don't want to have to do volumetrics in Blender because that's going to take a lot of time. So I just want to have a quick brush in Photoshop that lets me paint that stuff in like I did with the concept art. So that's kind of a basic list, and here's where the overlap occurs with village and the people, and different things like the birds and small details like that will be done with brushwork because they're not going to be much more than silhouettes, so they're not going to really take up a lot of time. And so now that I have an idea of software I'm using, the kinds of the process for the 2D and 3D assets that I need, I'm going to walk you through kind of the entire process and how this is going to work. So for this particular image, I'm first going to take any 3D assets that I use to help me build this concept piece and pull those over from the blocking stage into the detail stage and use those to speed the process up. So the sword's finished, but the ground and the water is a good example of that. I'll bring that over. Things like the sword or things that have a lot of focus in the image need to have more time allotted to spend texturing, working up the details, making them look really good, because there are the things that people are going to be looking at the most in the image. So I don't need to worry about the ships a lot because they're basically just shapes in the background. And here we go. Background elements, small details should be kept as rough as possible. Yeah. So no need to spend a lot of time working on stuff that isn't really going to get a lot of attention, have a lot of screen time. You'd be surprised how little you actually look at stuff that is out of focus or, in the background and small. So it is a balancing act. You need to make sure that you know how to balance things, and you don't want to just rush through everything and not spend a lot of time on things, but you want to make sure that you're definitely splitting your time up in a way that makes a lot of sense for what's going to be on the screen. So basically with the sword, it's currently a super high res subdiv mesh, and I want to retopo that and then prep it for texturing with UVs for Substance, Painter, and Designer. You can't bring super heavy assets into those, at least not with the graphics card I currently have. So I need to make sure that the heavy stuff is retopoed for that stuff. And then I want to make sure as I go through this scene, things don't get out of control in terms of poly count, because with, the adaptive subdivision and things like that I might try to use on the ground plane and the water, it could get out of control. And even though I'm going to be running this on a render farm, which is going to be Render Street, They do have limitations in terms of memory, so you can't just submit anything. You still have to think it through, which I learned as I was doing some tests last month. So I'm going to try to split everything off in render passes, separate foreground, middle ground, background as best that I can, and that way I don't have to re-render anything in the case of something not working. I'm going to be trying to use a PBR workflow for shading and lighting for most of this, if not all of it, and I will be doing that with Blender and Substance. And then anything that isn't completely finished in the final illustration in Blender will be touched up or painted over in Photoshop. So that's the basic process of how this is going to work. Hope you've enjoyed this video, and that is what I'm going to be doing this month. So check me out on Patreon, and I hope to see you there.